Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council in our still new building. To join us for this morning's event, Geothermal: Unlocking America's Untapped Energy Potential. And I think when we say the word untapped, I think it's in recognition of the fact that geothermal is a profoundly valuable energy resource to this country as we think about not just domestic energy security, but how we position the United States to be an energy leader in an ever more energy-hungry world. These realities have been reflected by the new administration's inclusion of geothermal in several consecutive executive orders that we saw over the past month, but also have been re-emphasized by Secretary Wright's inclusion of geothermal in his secretarial order a few weeks ago. And so it's why here at the Atlantic Council we're particularly excited to use this opportunity to launch a Atlantic Council in brief on what's next for geothermal here in the United States. That is available online, and I would encourage you to read it. And of course, I would like to thank my co-author for the report, Chase Tallheimer, for the great work that he has been able to do on this subject over the past year. Today, we're going to start with a fireside chat between Jeremy Harrell, CEO of ClearPath, and Governor Jared Polis of Colorado. We'll then move to an expert panel where we'll further unpack some of these issues and hopefully identify some of the next steps we need to see from both policy and industry in order to catalyze the potential for geothermal to contribute to the United States energy goals. I would mention that this conversation is live streamed. Hello to our online audience, in addition to those who are joining us in person today. And you will have the opportunity to ask questions using the askac.org platform on your iPhones. That's ac.org. You'll just enter in a question, and our moderators will be able to feed those into the conversation as we proceed today. So, without further ado, I would love to welcome Jeremy Harrell, Chief Executive Officer of ClearPath, and the Honorable Jared Polis, the Governor of Colorado, to get us started today. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Reed, for the kind introduction and for kicking us off today. As we mentioned, my name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ClearPath. I'm also a member of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group, and I'm honored to facilitate today's fireside chat with Governor Polis and frame today's conversation over geothermal. Geothermal technology, particularly near and dear to my heart. I spent time working in congressional Western delegations, particularly the Nevada delegation, where I saw firsthand how baseload clean energy resources like geothermal could play a significant role in meeting the state's clean energy goals and driving reliable, affordable, clean energy. But 15 years ago, it was narrowed down to those kind of states: Nevada, California, Idaho. And today's landscape looks drastically different. I'm really excited about the future of geothermal energy for really three key reasons. One, we've seen some immense private sector momentum among entrepreneurs. We're going to hear from one of the flagship companies doing that, Fervo, later today in the panel. We're seeing new investors flocking to this space, ranging from traditional oil and gas entities, big financial institutions that see the huge upside here, as well as venture focused on clean energy and climate. And there's new customers demanding this product because we have an immense national need for reliable zero-emission electricity, ranging from Google and Meta doing PPAs for new geothermal to significant other heavy manufacturing entities putting out requests for these 24/7 clean power. And so there's been significant momentum also on Capitol Hill here in the US, strong bipartisan support for policies that streamline regulations, make new investments in this technology, facilitate public-private partnerships. And we're seeing states get really excited about the opportunity here, and probably no state more excited about the opportunity here, and no US governor who has leaned into these issues more than Governor Polis. Before we get into questioning, I'll do a quick introduction of Governor Polis. But Governor Jared Polis is an entrepreneur, business leader, and dedicated public servant. Under his leadership, Colorado continues to build a clean energy economy that saves people money on energy bills, creates jobs, and protects our environment now and in the future. The Polis administration has worked with Colorado utilities to lock in more than 80% renewable energy by 2030, on a path to decarbonize the power sector by 2040. Really incredible progress. The governor is committed to pursuing innovations that protect our environment and save people money, including geothermal energy, and recruiting businesses to Colorado that are on the forefront of clean energy technology. Governor, you ran on this vision of 100% clean energy by 2040, and the energy landscape has changed drastically in just a few short years. How has rising energy demand, unprecedented growth, significant new investments in American manufacturing shaped your outlook on how a state like Colorado is going to meet that with the zero-emission assets?
Well, look, I think that the challenge of first of all, we even when I first ran, the vision and the pathway to 80% renewable energy or in the low 80s was very clear with the low-cost workhorses of solar and wind, and solar would be even cheaper if we didn't have tariffs on China. But we always wondered about the kind of how do we achieve that kind of 15%, 20% some storage, so maybe it's 10, 12% in the most cost-effective manner, and that's that very important space where it's everything from nuclear, tidal, natural gas, here in this case, geothermal, of course, so many different ways of looking at it. But when you look at that baseload piece, and you look at the geophysical opportunities in Colorado, we really feel, and I think this is a similar calculation for many Western states, geothermal has a tremendous opportunity to be extremely price competitive, reliable in that space. And many states already have it as part of their load. It's 0% in Colorado. It's not part of our grid. It's, I think, something like 4% in Nevada, maybe 5 or 6 in California, so and over 20% in Hawaii. So we're very excited about it. The new technologies that have come along really are on the deep well side, which really open up vast new opportunities for geothermal as well as the traditional ground level.
Yeah. How have some of these new public sector or private sector commitments from big energy consumers, folks like Google or Meta, who are making big investments in your state, and even on the manufacturing side, help shape your focus on trying to bring more reliable zero-emission electricity?
So first of all, and we're obviously right now in discussions with our legislature on data centers. There's an important positive role they can play for grid resiliency. I want to say done right. So I mean, that means, and this is generally the case, they have a steady demand over 24 hours for electricity. That's almost a given. The other part of being done right is where are they? The last thing that would make sense is to have them without transmission and then have to socialize the cost of transmission across regular retail customers. So if they're near transmission or generation, and the given that they're a steady user over 24 hours, very large user of electricity, they will help us in many ways build out additional renewable base capacity for the grid if we can count. And as I said, companies like Google have their own internal initiatives around carbon-free goals, renewable goals that further will help us being able to take into account that demand. So we're working on that, citing legislation largely involving, fair tax treatment and those sorts of things to try to encourage large users in our state when it helps our overall grid.
You flagged the transmission issue, obviously here in DC, significant debate in Congress about how to balance some federalism issues related to interstate infrastructure. What other barriers do you see, maybe here on the federal side, to Colorado meeting its goals, or things at the state level that you want to tackle in this session?
Transmission is really a big one. We can get into that. In a state like Colorado, we're of course 36% federal land, so of course the siting and permitting on federal land piece is important. Much of the western part of our state, and that overlaps with where there are a lot of geothermal opportunities. There's also geothermal opportunities on private land and state land, of course, but 36% of our state is federal. So, and it's even higher in Nevada and Utah. Yeah. So that's an important part of that discussion as well.
You flagged a little bit of the collaboration among the Western governors, and you made geothermal one of your signature platform issues as the head of a Western Governors Association. Can you talk a little bit about the partnership among Republican and Democratic governors across the West and the opportunity that you all see jointly?
Sure. So we elevated through the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative at the Western Governors Association the opportunity for geothermal, particularly geothermal electric. Obviously, we're also supportive of heat systems, and there's many opportunities for geothermal. But I think we're mostly talking about geothermal electric here in the West. And if you look at a map of geothermal, natural geothermal sources and United States, you'll see that the West is the hotspot, pardon the pun, but it really is. That's where it's likely to be and is most economical, most deployable, highest levels of heats, subsurface. It's also, in a state like Colorado, a lot of synergies with the oil and gas industry for accessing subsurface. We also have permitting synergies. So one thing we did in our state, and this is kind of a recommended best practice from our Heat Beneath Your Feet report, is we had a pre-existing Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. They did for decades, maybe even, I don't know how long, many decades, they've done the oil and gas siting in our state. What we did is we repurposed them. They still do oil and gas, of course. They are now called the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. And they also, in an analogous way, not an identical way, but in an analogous way, they now permit deep well geothermal. And so that was kind of a best practice. They've done their rules around that in consultation with the industry and set up what I think is one of the most expedited, reliable permitting regimes for geothermal in the country.
Yeah. One of the recommendations, and it kind of syncs up with what you just stated here from your report, was giving geothermal exploration similar treatment that oil and gas has on federal lands for exploration, something that has big bipartisan support in Congress, and I think hopefully we'll get across the finish line here in the next year or two. What are some of the other recommendations that came from your flagship report at WGA that you think Congress should really focus on as they look to unlock geothermal's potential?
So, I mean, the bulk of work we do is state focused, but we do have other federal, ideas in there. I mean, we obviously focus on the states, but certainly the permitting around federal land is absolutely key. You mentioned some of the other ones. I think just elevating geothermal, and I hope that a lot of that work and the goals that began in the Biden administration are carried over in that area in this new administration. I know they. And it's not mutually exclusive with other areas they have a focus on, and they seem to be bullish on nuclear and other areas. But I know that geothermal will absolutely be part of that as well.
Excellent. We're here at the Atlantic Council, so I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the global picture. And one effort you convened last year, that's interesting, Colorado and Iceland partnering on geothermal. What sparked that effort, and where do you think that's going to go?
Well, and I had the opportunity to visit Iceland last year as well. So, in Iceland, this is far from theoretical. It powers a big part of their grid. Yeah. So it's a majority of their grid, and essentially all of their home heating in their entire country, and pool heating and everything is geothermal. Now, it happens to be a volcanically active island, so you have you don't need this deep well stuff. It's kind of like Hawaii and Kona. I mean, it's more of the traditional technologies. But it sort of shows what you can do and deploy a low, inexpensive, renewable source of energy. The amazing thing about geothermal is basically the costs are the capital costs up front, extremely low operating costs over time, great durability. I mean, systems that have been put in place or in place for many decades. And frankly, I'd love to see on some systems, even if you can change the amortization and depreciation to 40 years or 50 years instead of 30, it really looks even better on paper given the extremely low operating costs over time. Some of the novel systems might not quite be able to do that yet because we don't know exactly the durability piece. But yeah, Iceland is geothermal, electric, and heating, and it does it. And so we had a joint, we have a Denver to Reykjavik flight, which is wonderful. It makes it very easy. And we had a bunch of Icelandic ministers and companies, and they are actually joint partners in at least one of our 3 utility scale geothermal projects that are moving forward in our state.
Excellent. Huge opportunities for that international partnership.
The one they're partners with is also kind of it's near surface geothermal, more analogous to the work they do in Iceland.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
And those are limited in Colorado. The deep well opens up so many areas to it, and it's very exciting. I mean, almost anywhere. We still have opportunity for near surface in particular areas and in particular ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is what has made so much of the excitement, and I think the piqued interest in Congress, not just from Western members, is these next generation of technologies open the aperture across the country and the role that geothermal can play. I've got a couple other questions for the governor. I just want to remind folks here on the crowd and watching electronically, askac.org if you'd like to submit a few questions to the governor. And again, askac.org. Governor, I'd like to talk a little bit about the current political dynamic. As Reed mentioned in his opening remarks, the Trump administration has pledged to unleash new American energy. Geothermal has been a big piece of that. How do you see geothermal fitting into the national energy strategy? And what do you think are some of the biggest opportunities in this political moment while you continue to lead at the state level in driving it forward?
Well, I think it's a key piece, because what you have is, again, very low operating cost over time. You have very minor surface potential conflicts. I mean, you look at something like nuclear, and again, it's years away from this is the price and we'll build it, but you also have controversy around siting, for example. It's not that any project has zero controversy, but generally speaking, geothermal plants are very good neighbors, and nobody particularly is out to get them, and they're easy to site. I mean, nothing's somebody doesn't I mean, some people don't want anything built ever, but generally speaking, it's a good, friendly thing to have near you. And of course, it's about American, self-sufficiency as well. And so it's really about how we can build out a strong American energy sector that meets the fast-growing needs. And again, not only data centers we talked about, but also electric cars. That's another huge area of growth. In Colorado, more than a quarter of new vehicles sold are electric vehicles. So this is rapidly overtaking internal combustion engines. And when you look at that, what that does, first of all, they have significantly lower operating costs than gas, so it saves consumers money. That's wonderful. About a third cost per vehicle mile traveled for average electricity price compared to average gas price. They both fluctuate. But it also is a net benefit to the grid. When we talk about data centers, that is, and when we talk about cars, they are, again, especially if, generally speaking, and they would be charged off peak hours themselves, batteries, units as well, that can play a constructive role in overall grid resiliency.
How has, you mentioned a little bit of the hairs on different technologies. Obviously, there's a big push, particularly now, to meet rising demand with more clean firm assets. And so you talk about nuclear a little bit, total agreement that a little further off, geothermal, an essential piece of that, carbon capture potentially could play a big role, and the oil and gas sector in your state can play a piece of that puzzle. Obviously, the Secretary of Energy from the great state of Colorado and Liberty actually made investments in all three of these technologies. Right? Or Secretary Wright has in some shape or form. How are you viewing more opportunities to collaborate with the existing oil and gas sector? You talked a little bit on the regulatory side, and how do you think the industry in your state is approaching this opportunity?
We've had some consolidation in the oil and gas sector. Our major operators, Occidental, Civitas, and Chevron. Now they represent probably 85–90%. That it was which is not, whether it's good or bad, I'll leave it to others, but it's good with regard to geothermal because these are major corporations that have initiatives in this area, especially Occidental already with test wells in our state. And again, whether it's them themselves or whether it is the technology transfer that can be deployed, the reduced cost of deep wells that can be transportable across different sectors like geothermal, those are all great benefits. And we're thrilled that companies like Oxy are engaged and interested in doing it. And again, whether they wind up in that space or not, we know that a lot of the underpinning technology that powers oil and gas also will power geothermal.
Yeah. Earlier, we were talking about the projects that are in the queue in the state right now. How has that early community engagement gone? I mean, obviously, we're not going to win the folks who are in the bananas camp to build absolutely nothing anywhere. How has that local engagement gone?
I know people like geothermal. I mean, first of all, it has a lot of consumer-facing pieces, which we embrace, namely, large area snowmelt systems. I mean, we're doing it, for example, at you might know, Vail is one of our well-known cities. Come visit, come ski. The snow is great. But in our central downtown area, we're effectively replacing it all with a geothermal heat system that will do everything from the snow melt to the building heating. And we will sort of advertise and promote that fact with placards and information in people's homes. We have one of the first colleges in the country, Colorado Mesa University, that is 100% geothermal heating and cooling for buildings. But all this kind of builds goodwill for the potential for geothermal electric. And so again, there's not, there's support, there's more knowledge about it. People like it, it's an easier sell than other alternatives like hydrogen and nuclear and, which have poorly founded fears and some legitimate concerns. But generally speaking, geothermal has been very warm reception.
That's great. That's great. I've got one question here from askac.org about the federal debate on tax policy. From your experience, how have you seen, for example, the tech-neutral tax credit that's aimed at supporting zero emissions clean electricity driving investment in Colorado because you've invited development like geothermal, and how do those federal policies complement what you're doing at the state level?
You probably are best off asking some of the operators in the space what would best help their capital stack and deployment. And I, of course, would be very supportive of federal tax consideration and incentives for zero generation technologies. I would, as a booster of geothermal, I'd support them whether they're technology agnostic or whether they're specific to geothermal. That would be welcome. That would be great. In Colorado, we do have a geothermal specific tax credit that we created. Anything states do is going to be kind of like icing on the cake compared to federal. But on the margins, we hope it accelerates projects, gets our state attention. Just as we're proud of our expedited regulatory approval process, we're also proud of our favorable tax treatment in that area.
That's great. Other areas that you see the legislature focusing on over the next couple years to try to drive in the state of Colorado?
Oh, it's our state legislature with regard to geothermal. Transmission is the next a key part, and that applies to everything from geothermal to the entire energy sector. We do need to make sure that we can get the additional transmission siting and approval done to have a more resilient and lower cost grid. And yes, we're worried about, different entities, local, et cetera, blocking or making it hard to do transmission where we need it, increasing costs. And that includes, opposition from potentially, left and right. I mean, it could be just a conservative county that makes it hard, or it could be an environmental group that makes it hard. But either way, we have to get the transmission built to be able to achieve our ambitious renewable energy goals. And so that's something that we're definitely leaning into as a state.
We talked a little bit about when you ran your vision on decarbonizing the power sector in Colorado. The end of this term, what is your goal? What would you like to see the current state of where Colorado is in that push, and how does geothermal fit in that?
Well, we will be, and our goal was always 80% renewable energy by 2030, and that is pretty much locked in by the end of my term. Most of it already is locked in because of the lead time. We will exceed that, meaning we will pass 80% probably in 2029 sometime in our state, and we'll be whether it's 80.5 or 82, we'll be above that, in 2030. Building out and the eyes on the 100% by 2040 is our focus now. And I am extremely optimistic that geothermal will absolutely be a part of that. I can't tell you today whether it'll be 1% or 5%, but it's going to be a significant part of that.
Well, thank you for your leadership, Governor. It really has been incredible to see you lean into this area and push forward, and we see the huge opportunities on clean energy across the West. So thank you for leaning into these issues.
Thank you for leading into them. I think the more federal help we can get in accelerating this transition, the better, on both the permitting and the tax treatment and capitalization side. And tech transfer as well. And then I hope other states are also forward-leaning on both expediting permitting as well to make it happen.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor.
Good to see you.
All right, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Governor Polis. That was a really, I think, great scene setter for the conversation we want to have for the next hour. A lot of discussion around the opportunity that geothermal presents for American self-sufficiency, what it means to meet demand, whether that be from data centers or from the just general growth of electrification we're seeing, both in the Western United States, but also when you look beyond and attempt to widen the aperture. I think that phrase, which Governor Polis mentioned when we look to enhance geothermal systems in particular, speaks to the opportunity curve that we see for this particular energy resource. And so to unpack this a little bit further, I'm pleased to welcome a really strong panel of experts, including Dr. Morgan Bazilian, the director of the Payne Institute and professor of public policy from the Colorado School of Mines, Dr. Ravi Chowdhury, former assistant secretary of the Air Force for Energy Installations and Environment, Brian George, the U.S. federal lead for global energy market policy and development at Google, Tim Latimer, the chief executive officer and co-founder at Fervo Energy, and Jack Waldorf, the executive director of the Western Governors Association. Just another reminder, we'll make this a conversational panel, but again, I would encourage our audience, both here in the building as well as online, to submit questions through the askac.org platform. I'll get them up here on the iPad and be feeding them into the conversation as we proceed for the next hour. But I think I might start with you, Tim. I was struck by what Governor Polis said about widening the aperture in terms of how we think about utilizing geothermal. And that very explicitly references the new geothermal technologies that are increasingly gaining momentum in this space, and EGS is one of them. Can you give us a little bit of your perspective? What is the current state of the geothermal industry look like overall, but what does the outlook for that industry look like over the next 5 years to a decade, particularly as we see some of these advanced geothermal technologies really begin to gain momentum?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I thought Governor Polis framed it really well. And I liked his references to Iceland, so I think we can talk about it there. What Iceland has in their energy system is quite unique, because geothermal has all these attributes that you want in an energy system. It's 24/7, it's carbon free. It also doesn't rely on fuel supply chains that could be a geopolitical hazard. And so if you're blessed with Iceland's geology, they've moved very fast in having a very strong energy security, low emission future. But historically, geothermal has been very, very limited to these places with unique geologic qualities. And if you're not Iceland, traditionally the word has been that you're sort of out of luck. And you look at that today, even though geothermal has everything that you want in sort of a fuel secure, carbon free resource, it accounts for less than 1% of U.S. electricity, and that's because conventional technologies can only tap into these unique volcanic areas and areas on rifts and things like that. And so you need to, if you want to sort of expand the aperture, develop new technology. And so I think one of the insights we had at Fervo is that means drilling deeper for lower cost, and that means getting more production out of wells, even if you're in geology that's not naturally productive. And so when we started the company, the insight we had was that those are a lot of the same technology challenges that were part of the early shale days. It was too tight to get productive flow rates and deeper than other basins, so it wasn't part of the cost curve. But what the oil and gas industry did with pushing forward innovation and technologies like better seismic mapping and hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling was really changed the supply game, where all of a sudden a lot more supply went from being cost prohibitive to in the money. And that's where you've seen this renaissance in oil and gas production. And we realized that the same drilling technologies would have a comparable look at what is happening in the United States for geothermal. And so when we think about the momentum of the industry, I'll talk about two things. One is where we're going, right? So less than 1% of US electricity today, it's only in certain states. Our belief, and we've worked on this with NREL and academic institutions and the Department of Energy, is that number can go from 3 gigawatts to 300 gigawatts by 2050. And that's because these new technologies push so much of the geology into the cost-effective spot in the supply curve that you can develop it. And it's not just us believing this. I think one of the things Governor Polis talked about too was a huge push from the private sector, where there's a lot of momentum for this now. And to give you some examples, one example of this, Fervo was started in 2017, so 8 years ago. In 2018, we raised our first seed round of funding, and we raised $500,000 of venture capital to move forward the geothermal industry. And I'm pretty sure that the entire total of venture capital funding that went into geothermal in 2018 was $500,000. And it's just not a sector that the investment community was excited about. And you fast forward to just last year, and Fervo alone raised over $500 million last year through participation from, leading our Series D, Devon Energy, which I think is the perfect example of the oil and gas industry getting into it. But we also raised debt financing for the first time because people are viewing this as a bankable, mature technology for the first time, and of course DOE support. And so, we have 100x'd the amount of financial capital going into the geothermal space. I think what we're going to do is probably 100x that again over the next few years, because it just has all these solutions that the world needs right now in terms of an energy resource. And so there's enormous momentum to widen the aperture of what geothermal can do, and the technology's there to get it done.
There is so much positive momentum. I mean, the arc of just Fervo's growth in this space is really profound. But with all that potential, it begs the question in my mind, like, how close are we to wide scale, geothermal deployment? And if we aren't yet that close, what are those we'll call them those last mile policy or private sector or technology related issues that we need to resolve in order to achieve those kind of ambitious goals?
Yeah, we are incredibly close, because this is a technology that's come down the learning curve and the cost curve very rapidly. You just compare last year's National Renewable Energy Laboratory technology forecast for deep enhanced geothermal systems to this year's, and they showed a 50% year-over-year reduction in costs. We think when they rerun the numbers of 2025 with the new drilling costs we've published, we're going to get yet another 50% reduction in costs. So the costs are coming down very rapidly. We're in a position right now where the project, we call it Project Cape, that we're developing in Utah, is a cost-effective project today. We're making enough of a financial return on it that we can attract equity and debt financing for the project. Our customers are very happy with getting a round-the-clock baseload carbon-free product, and so we're there. And the policy support's key. We're currently at a cost structure where the tech-neutral tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act are very helpful in us closing that gap, because even though we're coming down the cost curve, we're still on that steep slope. And so for the next couple projects we do, I think that we're going to be in a position where continuity around these tax credits and then streamlining permitting, two of the things Governor Polis talked about, so that we can shorten our project construction timelines to help with the investment return, are going to be absolutely critical to being successful. But if you look at Fervo's target, and we've talked about this a lot publicly, we want to reduce our CapEx by 2030 on these projects to below $3,000 per kilowatt of installed cost. And if we're able to achieve that, Governor Polis also highlighted another great attribute of geothermal: very low operating costs. So it's kind of all in the CapEx. If we can bring our CapEx down to that target, all of a sudden you're talking about an energy resource that is going to be one of the cheapest ways to get electricity, period. And it doesn't matter what the tax credit support is or not. Right now it's very critical because we're in the steep slope of that cost curve. But I think unlike some other technologies, we're going to hit a cost reduction target in the very near future that is that delivers a product that will just sell itself, regardless of this policy support. But the key is to keep our foot on the gas and really accelerate through this time period where we're continuing to rapidly drive down our drilling and development costs.
And one of the real driving forces associated with why we are so close is, I think, the amount of pull that we're now getting from the demand side of the energy system is tangible, particularly when it comes to 24/7 clean baseload opportunities like geothermal. So I might use that as an opportunity to transition to Brian and Ravi to walk us through kind of what the composition of that demand really looks like. So Brian, I'll start with you. Google has been a major driver of clean energy investment, both in terms of your own corporate goals, but also recognizing, frankly, the reality that cost curves are coming down, and this is actually an economic investment as you seek to expand your own assets domestically here in the United States. I'll give you a big, broad question that you can take however you please. How does Google see specifically geothermal contributing to Google's energy demands, but also more broadly, U.S. energy security, job creation, long-term economic growth, all three being issues that Google finds itself rather at the heart of these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think just to start, it's absolutely essential, right? As Governor Polis so rightly noted, our demand is generally 24/7 demand. That means we need 24/7 power. And so the benefit that can come from enhanced geothermal and the 24/7 base load, clean, firm power that it provides is going to be critical to solving our reliability needs going forward. But it's not just us, right? Like, yes, there is a lot of growth from our sector, from things like demand. But again, as Governor Polis noted, it's also things like electrification. It's things like reshoring of domestic manufacturing, bringing jobs and production back here to the United States that are all going to depend on additional firm round-the-clock power. And so, yes, it's critical for our growth, but it's also critical for our broad economic security here in the United States. And so I think as we move forward, it's going to be a piece of the puzzle. We are obviously also looking at other sources of clean, firm power like nuclear, like CCUS, all of these things that, again, fill the gaps from a reliability perspective that we don't get from intermittent resources. And so, as you noted, Google has been a leader in procuring clean energy, both through our investment in things like wind and solar, but also, of course, through our investment in partnership with Fervo, which in 2021, I think as folks know, we announced the world's first corporate purchase offtake agreement with Fervo, and in 2023, we grew that. And so we are obviously very excited about the trajectory of both the industry and the company. And I think there are a lot of unique things beyond just the types of technologies that are kind of created by partnerships like this, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, I tend to think a lot about what are the regulatory structures that we need to have in place to be able to bring on these types of new resources that, are in stages where they require significant capital investment, right? It's going to require a little bit of a nudge from companies like Google, and we are very proud of what we have pioneered in Nevada, something we have dubbed our Clean Transition Tariff, which is effectively a way for us as the private sector to come in and help support companies like Fervo and other developers to bring on resources that do provide that 24/7 baseload power in a way that all grid customers can benefit from the reliability and clean benefits of those resources. And so we actually think that is something that can be scaled broadly here in the US, and we're excited to see where that goes. But at the end of the day, it is a critical piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And one piece of what you mentioned there was successful partnerships like the one Google has with Fervo can be the model by which to show where policy can actually be very precise in terms of enabling, scale, and and kind of resolve what has been a challenge with clean energy policy making at the federal level sometimes, which is you're trying to solve so many different things with one big policy package, right? We need precision in those policies, and it's those type of partnerships that really show where the demand signal for policy intervention is in a really precise manner. I want to return to that when we talk about how we accelerate geothermal from a policy and industry perspective. But before I move on to there, Ravi, as former Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Energy Installations and Environment, you are also deeply exposed to the demand side and contributing to the demand side contributions for geothermal. The Defense Department is one of the largest energy consumers in the country, and I think is also increasingly thinking about securing its energy supply. During your tenure, in fact, the Air Force initiated geothermal energy projects at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho and Joint Base San Antonio, Texas. I guess let's take a step back, and if you could give us some insight into why geothermal was considered a viable option for these bases. And I guess as a follow-up question to that, how does it support these ideas around the resilience of installations and the security of supply for the department as it advances its very, very critical national security goal?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And first of all, hats off to the people on the stage. 30 days into my transition, I'm super excited to say that the views I express do not express the views of the Department of Defense on this day. But I will say this, we are in the midst, from a defense and national security perspective, we're in the midst of a decade of consequence. A decade of consequence in which potential adversaries are looking at ways to gain a strategic advantage against our nation. Now think about that when it comes to our installations and defending the nation. We know now that potential adversaries like China are looking to go directly at our infrastructure in order to disrupt military operations. Now, when it comes to the United States Air Force, Space Force, our installations are the platforms from which we project combat power. That means we have to get the jets out of town. That means we need critical redundancies in nuclear command and control from the highest priorities to be uninterrupted at reliability levels that cannot be disrupted. Now, more broadly, we know that our adversaries are looking to not only disrupt those operations by going straight for our infrastructure at our installations, but they're doing that with initially starting with civil disruption. And that's where the partnership here becomes so relevant, so important. And quite honestly, I believe it will be the margin of victory in not only a conflict, but in global competitiveness. So we need to think about that more deeply. And why did I turn during my tenure to alternative methods of generating energy? It's very simple. We can't afford not to. One, we got to bring and up our game in innovation over the next decade. Otherwise, our adversaries will. Our global competitors will. So by doing that at our installations, geothermal is a natural methodology by which we can build redundancy and ruggedize our installations against potential threats. This is not a theoretical or a potential issue. We know it's a problem right now. And so we're embarking on ways in which we can build critical redundancies at our installation. And we've talked about regulatory frameworks and things like that. I always say that we can ill afford to move at the speed of government these days. We have to move at the speed of the threat, in my case, when it comes to national security, and across the board, the speed of innovation. And so to me, it's a rallying cry, and why we established these two particular pilots is important, because in San Antonio, there are so many installations that are concentrated in a single location. Everything from mobilizing air mobility, training capabilities, medical capabilities, everything in that joint base structure can be impacted by the amount of energy we produce. Now, in places like Mountain Home, we have a new deployed combat wing concept that we're laying down. And so to get the jets out of town quickly, we're going to need to have the ability to plug out of the local grid, maintain proper storage, get the jets out of town, and then plug back into the grid so we can distribute that energy to prevent more civil disruption. That's the power of geothermal and what it can do. Because as the governor stated, that it's honestly pretty easy to maintain. It takes amount of investment to get it moving, but over time the opportunity costs reduce. And that's where partnership comes in. We're looking to, as a DoD during my tenure, to ensure that we develop enhanced use leases, third-party financing capabilities that allow industry and the local community to partner with the installation. Now, what do DoD installations have that's of value? Land. And so through enhanced use leases, we allow capabilities to bring new energy sources, but at the same time, the value proposition for industry is that they get security. And we know that energy resources can be under threat at times, and providing vital security is a cost-saving measure. So across the spectrum, I would have to say that we need to do more of this. I would like to see 10 to 14 more pilots in the future, but that's up for the next administration to decide upon. So to me, an invaluable amount of potential is waiting for us in geothermal, and we've got to get moving with it. And that's why we started those 2 pilots.
Right. So, okay, we got the supply side picture covered. Clear demand signal, right, both now and well into the future. I think I want to move to talking a little bit about how we enable and accelerate that opportunity to be realized. And so, Morgan, I think I'll turn to you first. One of the themes that was articulated both by Governor Polis during the fireside chat, but was also brought up again by Tim, is the transferability of the oil and gas industry's expertise with subsurface exploration, drilling, reservoir management, et cetera. What are the specific tools, technologies, or best practices from the oil and gas industry that we can most effectively apply to accelerate EGS deployment and development?
Thanks, Reed. Thanks for having me. Your new digs are terrific. I think the first time I sat on a geothermal panel was 30 years ago. And at that point, California had roughly 6% of its electricity coming from geothermal, and today it has roughly 6% of its electricity coming from geothermal. There were enhanced geothermal projects in New Mexico. We used to call it, what do we call it, hot, dry rock. That's what you called what is today closer to what Tim and his colleagues are doing. So it's lovely to see excitement about geothermal, because frankly, there hasn't been much excitement about geothermal for a long time. And it has analogies in oil and gas. It also has analogies in solar and wind. So I'll describe what I mean by that. 10 years ago, I wrote a paper that said, I'm an academic, so I have to talk about papers, but the paper said something like, it's time to stop calling these things alternative. And we were mostly focused on solar at that point. And what we meant was, they're no longer alternative if they're cheap and commercially viable, and they have real companies that are traded on stock exchanges and raising real capital to the level that Tim alluded to, billions in other words, and you're starting to see really rapid growth. And the kind of numbers that you're seeing that Tim is describing there, in either dollars for energy itself and megawatt hours, or dollars per megawatts or kilowatts in terms of capital costs, come down rapidly. And the kind of figures we're seeing, that 50% decline year on year or close to it, is the same kind of decline we saw we've seen over the last decade or two in solar. But did the physics change in solar? Or did the thermodynamics change in geothermal? No, right? You still have a particle wave duality happening in photovoltaics, and it'll happen until the Earth doesn't exist anymore. And the thermodynamics and fluid flow in geothermal has not changed very much either. So when we look at the shale revolution, as we call it in the United States, the numbers, the potential numbers, remember the potential numbers at the USGS for shale were, the potential just kept going up and up and up by orders of magnitude, right? Not by little amounts. Did the actual molecules of natural gas change at all during that time? No. So it was just a technology play. And those technologies were primarily the two things that the governor mentioned and Tim mentioned, which is fracking, hydrological fracturing, and horizontal drilling, or directional drilling. And that changed the potential, and then it changed the finance. And that's exactly what you're seeing here in geothermal today, largely due to Fervo and Tim's efforts, but of course there's researchers and others working on those issues. But fundamentally, that came out of the shale revolution and the research that spans not just petroleum engineering, but geology, geophysics, et cetera. But it also has not just subsurface technologies and research, but what the oil and gas industry learned about community engagement, what the industry learned about project management, what the industry learned about finance and how to finance these things, what it learned about permitting and how to deal with mineral rights. And some of those things are very specific to the United States, like mineral rights, and some are not. So I think and there's other analogies besides either in the renewable space. So we see now Exxon and Equinor drilling for lithium, something called DLE, direct lithium extraction in the Smackover in Arkansas, using their knowledge of both above ground management and subsurface. And you also see at the School of Mines, we have a lot of research on something called geological hydrogen, which is naturally occurring hydrogen. I can't remember what color it's called. Gold, maybe? You always assign a color to hydrogen. But in any case, the kind of things we're seeing, for even the drill bits that Tim and others are using, are continuing that innovation from the oil and gas industry. And that now has made its way into mining. So in mining, it used to be it would take them forever to drill down thousands of meters. Now they can use some of the technologies from oil and gas to do the same thing. And so when we're talking about geothermal, the fact that you can get to 5,000 to 7,000 meters down rather handily and then go horizontal will bring those costs down dramatically. And it's terrific to see another technology come online and have its day and go from alternative to the center stage.
And one of what you're really pointing at here is when we talk about how the United States advances its own energy system through energy transformation, pulling on legacy industrial expertise has a huge value to sharpening the innovation edge, right? And innovation, very much a classically bipartisan issue that should be embraced, not just as we think about advancing geothermal, but the host of other clean energy technologies that that provide opportunities for the United States, its partners and allies, et cetera. Jack, I want to bring you on this issue, because I think we do see a confluence of bipartisan features with geothermal. We have the the idea of using an indigenous resource base for energy security. We see the opportunity for innovation and the opportunity, therefore, for the United States to show additional leadership in the energy system within its maintained a level of primacy for the last half century. And then we also see the opportunity for, again, clean energy, allowing the United States and its private sector to meet those clean energy baseload targets that I think still are a very, very important part of the private sector. I guess I'm kind of answering. My question was, how challenging has it been to bring leaders from both sides of the aisles together in support of geothermal energy? I might have just answered that, but I mean, speak a little bit more to the bipartisan nature of this, and particularly at WGA, how has this conversation gone from a very Western state conversation to a national one?
Well, we love that it was a Western state conversation first, because we take a lot of pride in that. But yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the governor talked about it through his chair initiative. It was something that I think he's continued to be out front on some of these issues, has seen the advantages of it, both from natural resources and what is in Colorado, but what he's seen across the region, and that the U.S. has continued to and will continue to be a leader in this space as long as we take advantage of the moment. So I think that was, in conversations with him, that was a lot of his motivation in getting behind it. Now, it wasn't a tough sell, quite frankly, with his colleagues in the West. I think, as part of the initiative, we went to 4 different states, including Colorado. We were in Utah, Hawaii, and Idaho. You mentioned Idaho's leadership. And it's not by accident, right? As the governor talked about, you look at the map, there's a lot of assets there in the Western United States. And it's pretty clear, obviously, with the installations that the Assistant Secretary talked about in Texas and in Idaho, taking advantage of those opportunities. But yeah, I mean, I think you're starting to see that momentum. We use a lot of, or I have, and I get in trouble sometimes of how many puns I used in the space, but it continues to gain steam. Mm-hmm. Abby, that's for you if you're in online there, so thank you for that. But yeah, I think you see that effort growing. I think the report that came out in June of 2023 at our annual meeting continues to be a critical part of that conversation, and you're seeing it at the congressional action level, right? And it's by no accident that you're getting Western senators, Western House members, in bipartisan fashion, bipartisan and bicameral, working together to address this. So thankfully, it's not a huge challenge. We have other challenges that are sometimes more of an issue to get that bipartisan or, quite frankly, nonpartisan support, but thankfully geothermal is not one of them.
I might actually bring you in then on this question. I mean, geothermal is not an area where we lack for bipartisan support, but it's still exposed to some of these enabling policy environment factors that are a little tricky to navigate on the bipartisan front. Specifically, and as Governor Polis mentioned, siting and permitting, right? Not just for the project itself, but also how you tie it to these wider issues around transmission. Could you reflect a little bit for us on how you can enable better, use geothermal as a way to possibly pull permitting reform and things out of this sort of bipartisan, I'm not going to use the word swamp, but this bipartisan sort of friction point. I didn't use that. But how do we enable the bipartisan momentum around geothermal to unstick some of the issues around permitting, which are ultimately going to support geothermal success over the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, ultimately, you continue to build on, as we talked about, the momentum, right? Mm-hmm. I think states are playing a critical role, but they can't do it alone, right? States can lead the way by putting some investments on the front end, and they are, and we're seeing a lot of that across the Western footprint. But then I think you have to build and streamline the state permitting processes, and I know a lot of our governors have led the way on that and have continued to shine a good example with respect to that. But you've got to bring in the industry support. You got to bring in the research capacity within the various institutions to show and highlight that, right? I think You look the example, we were in Utah, or I guess for the initiative workshop, we saw the Utah Forge, right? You see this collaboration of industry and higher education and research capacity with the Department of Energy, and it was a multifaceted approach, which you're not going to see one of our governors not talk about the power of the partnership, right? And the way that you continue to do that and highlight that and then showcase that. But yes, states have to continue to lead the way in that effort to show that it's working. But then that way it then promotes and highlights among the industry experts, but then also you can see that at the federal level where you can see the laboratories of democracy working and the feds being able to say, hey, we want a part of that action as part of that. Thankfully, and we're seeing through Secretary Wright's recent order that geothermal is a key part of that. So we're anxious to work with the administration and congressional leaders to continue to build that out. But yeah, it's going to continue to be an effort of education and highlighting those successes when they're made.
Absolutely. I want to also go to kind of our broader ecosystem of enabling factors, one of those being really just getting more investment, more capital into these projects. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to pull in one of the questions we've gotten from askac.org, and I'll direct it to you, Tim. Have you seen in your project development an appetite amongst large power off-takers to take a direct equity stake in EGS projects to lower perhaps borrowing costs or something of that nature? Brian, I mean, Google as a major source of demand might have something to say about this as well, but Tim, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something we've had a lot of discussion with our customers about, and I could say it's a potential solution to the capital problem of funding geothermal, but it's not the only one. And I think actually to talk a little bit about the clean transition tariff work that we've done with Google, I think one thing that if you're not in the power sector, it's sort of hard to sift through all the announcements and press releases to kind of figure out what means what. And one thing that I'll say that makes a huge difference in mobilizing capital is binding offtake agreements. And so, what we did with Google, this is a long-term partnership. We announced our first project with them in 2021. We almost immediately got to work on sort of the second project. And contracting in the power space is an incredibly difficult thing to do. You've got to come up with a very long commercial offtake agreement. There's got to be strong risk allocation. You've got to understand the financing implications behind it. But there's also other stakeholders there. You've got to involve the utility that is in your area. You also have to involve the Public Utility Commission that's in your area. And so one of the things that has made a huge difference in Fervo's ability to attract capital actually is it's one thing to have a press release about sort of a non-binding bilateral agreement where nobody's actually putting any capital in or any risk in. And I think sometimes our space now that energy is such a hot topic, gets flooded with that. So it's hard to parse through the signal for the noise. But I can tell you the deal we have with Google, which was doing the hard work of bringing the utility to the table, bringing the Public Utility Commission to the table, and creating a binding offtake agreement, it took us over 3 years to go from sort of initial discussions to Public Utility Commission approved contract. And that work is huge because you actually, to build real infrastructure projects, the kind of capital you need to unlock is infrastructure investment. And infrastructure investment will not get hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars off the sidelines based off of a non-binding press release. You have to have a binding regulatory commission approved offtake agreement. And I think one thing to give Google a lot of credit is they recognize this. And we did collectively the hard work, not just between Google and Fervo, but all of the other stakeholders we had to get around the table to get there. And so the fact that we've unlocked all this financing, in our case, it's not coming directly from our customers, but it wouldn't be possible without putting that work in. And so I think that's one of the areas to continue to mobilize money off the sidelines and into this is to mobilize billions of dollars, you have to get infrastructure investors involved. And to get infrastructure investors involved, you need binding long-term offtake agreements. And that is where I see customers playing the more catalytic role. We're always talking about creative other financing solutions, but by far and away creating a binding regulatory approved contract that you can take to the bank, literally, there's my pun, is what gets capital off the sidelines.
Brian, I want you to lean in on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great point, and I think it really comes back to this notion of like that is financial skin in the game, right? I mean, we are coming to the table and saying, you know, look, press releases are fine, but at the end of the day, we need to support you in a way that can actually get the project up and scaled, right? And we're getting megawatts onto the grid to support megawatts that we are bringing onto the grid. It is real skin in the game. And so I think our hope is, right, that we can dedicate our resources, our demand, frankly, our capital, right, to be able to replicate structures like the one that we pioneered in Nevada and take it elsewhere. The other thing, though, and I want to go back to sort of a point that has been raised a couple times, but also by the governor, which is around transmission. And I think, you know, historically, we have sort of thought about transmission as an enabler of wind and solar to the grid. That is no longer just the case, right? Transmission is a tool to unlock economic and national security, right? It is a tool for us to bring more loads onto the grid, for new manufacturing entities to bring new plants onto the grid, for new resource developers to bring new generators on the grid. It is broader, right, than just sort of this very narrow focus of bringing more wind and solar on. And so I think, to be quite frank, one of the biggest challenges we see right now in further investment in new resources, right, there's a ton of demand, there's a ton of capital ready to go. If we can't connect those things to the grid, and if we can't connect our loads to the grid, it doesn't matter as much, right? And so in the spirit of bipartisanship, which I'm hearing a lot of, and frankly, it makes me very hopeful to hear that, we need to turn our attention to things like transmission and make that a bipartisan issue that gets bipartisan support. I was very happy to hear Secretary Wright's comments during confirmation on this, but it seems like that's the direction that we're going, but we really have to shift the mindset, because I think once we start to see a little bit of certainty about sort of additional transmission additions, right, I think you're going to start to unlock more investment. I also, the final point I would make on that transmission piece is there is absolutely a role for the federal government to play in that. There is also equally, absolutely a role for state and local governments to play in that as well. The last thing we need to do is come in with a very heavy-handed approach and say, this is the line that shall be built, without consulting governors and county councils, right, and local entities. It has to be a collaborative process. I know that is hard, but that's the only way we're going to build infrastructure in this country in a way that leads to the type of additional development and growth that we are all talking about here.
So actually, those are very strong comments, very good comments related to the need to make sure that these geothermal assets are have the connectivity to the wider grid, and it actually begins to answer a question from the audience related to, we've heard a lot about behind the meter assets in the context of geothermal deployment. And I can leave it to you to answer, from Google's perspective, is geothermal only a behind-the-meter solution absent, wider transmission build out that enables it to connect to the grid. But I think also it's an opportunity for Ravi to speak to, what is the purpose of a geothermal asset on a military installation, both in terms of either resiliency or ruggedizing the installation from wider operational threats. Does that necessarily lend itself to possibly geothermal being more of a behind-the-meter solution just for military installations? How do we think about the balance between geothermal as a asset that enables a data center like Google's to have reliable, clean 24/7 baseload power, but connect to the wider grid, versus being that resiliency solution that perhaps a military installation needs in certain cases?
That's a great question. I'll get to that in a second, but I want to build upon Brian's point and the previous point on bipartisanship and where we're at right now. And the reality is this. We can't advance this capability without a concerted effort between academia, industry, and government. That's how this moves forward, because there's going to be new regulatory processes that come out of this. Government has to be receptive to that. Industry must be ready to innovate and push the boundaries of it, but not too far. But at the same time, we have a whole infrastructure that needs to track together to ensure this is successful, to include international partners. Right now, I mean, honestly, where we're sitting right now, is a constriction of research capabilities. That's going to be a challenge. Constriction of partnerships. And we're coming off a rather cringeworthy performance in Europe, followed by a cancellation of USAID, which is going to affect partners who want to invest in new energy in their localities. So that's very dependent on the aid that comes to them. In fact, most countries that invest in aid invested in energy production and opportunities. And to me, this is very critical in the Pacific, where our adversaries are really, really watching closely the pullback of aid and are very, very ready to fill the gap in investment and gain a strategic advantage and leverage in places where we don't want them to. So this is a critical point. But going back to your question, to me, it's an issue of ubiquity. The more capabilities you can put on an installation to diversify your energy capabilities, the more resilient you can make it. And to me, transmission, everything from transmission lines and technologies, and going back to capabilities that have been brewing for many, many years, and ones that we need to get ahead of, are finding blocks from a governmental standpoint, and it's getting caught in a either-or situation from one aisle to the next. But let me close the comment with a little bit of hope. I recently had a roundtable with a member of our energy committees and on the House side, and he was coming out of a Republican discussion, and he was very clear that he wants to keep supporting IRA because of the opportunity that it provides and the benefit it is energizing our local communities with. That's my pun for today. But the value of that to me is very, very promising. So we're going to have a dips here as we go through some of these sweeping cuts that are going to affect our research institutions profoundly, to include global partners. But in the end, we have to look to find ways to leverage the capabilities that are going to make us more competitive.
Brian, I don't know if you want to get in on this behind the meter versus grid integrated sort of discussion a little bit.
It feels like a conversation I can't avoid these days. And as we speak, I think FERC is taking some action to address this very issue. So I'm sure my phone will be blowing up when I get done. The only thing I would say is I think at a very high level, you know, the reliability and resilience benefit that is provided by the bulk power system is really difficult to match. At the end of the day, our view is that grid should be planned in close partnership with developers and off-takers and utilities in a way that enables that grid to grow and work for everybody, right? Because a good grid, a reliable grid, an economic grid is good for the country. I do think there are opportunities in sort of this co-location space, if you will, whereby we might be able to accelerate the addition of new loads and new generation to the grid, particularly ones that aren't as dependent on things like vast network transmission upgrades. And so I think there's opportunity, but I would just underscore the reliability, resilience, and economic points that the grid provides. Difficult to match that.
Yep. We've got a few questions from the audience about one enabling factor which we haven't really addressed yet, which is workforce development, right? And I really want to use this as an opportunity to bring in three different pieces of the panel. Morgan, I think this is the workforce development piece of the geothermal story is something you've cared deeply about. Obviously, It's at the core of Colorado School of Mines' mission. I'd love to start with your thoughts on the workforce development issues associated with the space, but then also bring Jack in almost as this was something we were speaking about earlier, in kind of the enabling that workforce to exist. And then Tim, I think it ultimately comes down to getting those skills, that training into the private sector and helping you do what you do. So let's start with academia and then move into the private sector.
Great, thanks. Just one comment on the finance piece to go back. There's a lot of talk about grids. What there's less talk about is the structure of electricity markets and how electricity is traded. And geothermal has the possibility, because of aspects of thermal inertia, to meet demand when it's highest, and that can have a huge financial benefit. The other thing, geothermal has the same type of upfront capital cost structure of other renewable energy, and those types of projects are very sensitive to inflation, currency risk, and cost of capital. And so all of those things come in to add to the capital stack and the complexity of the financing we've been talking about. When I go to conferences or meetings around the world, the one main hurdle to getting things built, aside from the investment and finance piece, is workforce. And so you can go to any large multinational EPC, company that builds stuff, and they will tell you, what I'm lacking is trained people to build these things. I can build anything, and a lot of them are agnostic to what they build, whether they're going to take a contract for a geothermal plant or an LNG facility or a wind farm. The limiting factor remains people. And we are laser focused on this at the School of Mines. Our students, 100% of our students get multiple job offers across industry. And so the workforce, like money, is fungible. It doesn't have to go into geothermal. It doesn't have to go into any of these infrastructure projects. It goes to where it gets the highest return. And the students and the trained people are in the same position. In other words, they're going to where there's excitement or there's some kind of value add for them, or where they're making the best salaries. And that does not necessarily, that means the energy sector writ large, not just the geothermal, is competing with things like AI and quantum and data science and all kinds of other things completely out of the infrastructure sector. And so there's a challenge of the amount of people we as one small university are putting into this infrastructure space and the energy space. And if we don't find ways to make it exciting, and that's why I'm so happy to see geothermal up on the center stage at the Atlantic Council, then we will fail to train the workforce of the future we need.
So we got to make it exciting, but we know there is this is about bringing people into the field of infrastructure and training. How do we enable those future workers to be successful, Jack?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I go back to the power of the partnership, right? I mean, I'm glad you're asking from the various sectors, right? Because each group has a role to play in creating the workforce of tomorrow, right? I think the governors have been laser focused. I mean, you're not going to come across a governor that's not worried about shovel-ready projects and workforce, right? Jobs, jobs, jobs. And I think understanding and meeting the moment, and I'm glad that you mentioned it doesn't necessarily have to be geothermal, because it's translatable, right, across multiple sectors, including as well as just energy. But I think it's providing, making sure academia and industry are talking. It's making sure that government is providing the right programs or pathways or incentives, or in some cases letting the market do its thing, right? So I think everybody has a role to play, but it doesn't happen without clear communication, conversations like this. So the more and more we have these groups of conversations and collective group of various industry sectors coming together, will hopefully provide that pathway to it. But I think it's being creative, again, going back to state-led efforts, ways that you can promote it and incentivize it, academia taking on that part of it, and then industry going to academia. And it's not academia saying, here's what we think you need, right? It's actually hearing from industry and say, what do you need? And how do we create curriculum that gets folks right in that position? So upon graduation, they can get those salary placements. And we talked in the green room about all the other added pressures, right? So housing, workforce, so we could do all we want to do around creating workforce in various, but if we don't have any place to house them, that's also a problem. So that's, again, an all-the-above strategy for all these industries to come together to make sure we tackle some of these pressing challenges.
And all of the above strategy for workforce development for an all of the above energy system,
There you go.
it sounds like.
Yeah.
Tim, workforce development, I think you're growing. It's got to be an issue that's front of mind for y'all.
I'm so glad you asked the question, because I actually think the workforce advantage is probably the #1 explainer for why geothermal is finding so much success so quickly. I myself started out my career in the oil and gas industry. I was a drilling engineer in South Texas. We were drilling on a Helmerich & Payne Flex 3 drilling rig. That was when I started my career almost 15 years ago. The drilling rig we have right now at our site in Utah is a Helmerich & Payne Flex 3 drilling rig. And the amazing amount of innovation that has gone into all the drilling progress that you've seen over the last 10 or 20 years we can use directly. And I can tell you, by the way, the crew in that drilling rig immediately prior to coming at our site was drilling oil wells in North Dakota. 1 week the crew's drilling oil wells, they mobilized the rig to Utah, they're drilling geothermal wells the next week. And it is incredible the workforce advantage that the United States has when it comes to the skilled workers of the drilling industry specifically. I go to our safety meetings all the time, and I can tell you, when you work in the drilling side, people love talking about their longevity. And so if you ever introduce yourself, people will tell you, first sentence out of their mouth will be how many years they've been in the oil field. So everybody goes around, oh, I broke out in 1992. I've been doing this for 17 years. It's hard to find another industry where you have a skilled workforce that is filled with people who've been doing it for decades. And you look across the geopolitics of the modern energy system where things are being built, a lot of US policy today is focused on playing catch up in areas where we've already lost the lead. You look at the solar supply chain and the skilled workforce. You look at the wind supply chain and the skilled workforce. You look at the battery supply chain and the skilled workforce. Those are areas where we took our eye off the ball and we lost the lead. We have never lost the lead in drilling. Nobody in the world has the skilled workforce out there that the United States does when it comes to drilling. And with geothermal, if we make sure we don't take our eye off the ball here, we can easily transition those skills directly because it's the exact same skills to drill a well. There's no retraining required. You're drilling an oil well one day, you can do geothermal the next. And I think that is one of the unique American competitive advantages that we have. And I'll tell you, it's not just on the subsurface side. Even one of the things about our project that makes it possible is we're located near the Intermountain Coal Power Plant in central Utah. That plant is being decommissioned this year. There are 400 people that work at that plant who are going to be out of a job when that plant gets decommissioned. We've already started hiring those operators because you look at a geothermal power plant, you have rotating equipment and turbines and heat exchangers and pressure control equipment. It's the exact same skills. You know who makes a phenomenal geothermal power plant operator? Somebody who's spent 20 or 30 years as a coal plant operator. And so it's both sides of our business. It's the power plant and the drilling. This is something that, unlike other parts of the modern energy mix, the U.S. is uniquely advantaged in our skilled workforce, and that is going to allow geothermal to grow far more rapidly. It's also going to mean as other countries catch on and figure out that geothermal is going to be a massive part of the energy mix, the U.S. is going to have an enduring competitive advantage because nobody else has these multi-decade, career-long, skilled workforce people who know how to operate drilling rigs and who know how to operate power plants the way we do in the United States. And I think that is probably the reason to be the most excited about what geothermal can offer our country.
It's a hugely enthusiastic way for us to conclude. I mean, we have the national security element of why geothermal contributes not just to our economic success, but also the success of the warfighter and our core national security needs, but also when we talk about the long arc of energy transformation that's occurring, how we think as a country about establishing comparative advantages and being competitiveness. Competitiveness is increasingly a buzzword right now, but we might actually have something in the workforce right now, in the natural resource base right now, which immediately gives us that advantage and that competitive edge. So really thrilled to have this panel join us today. Again, I wouldn't be thinking correctly if I wouldn't be highlighting the fact that we just published a report on the future of geothermal here at the Atlantic Council. Please visit our website to check that out. But I can't imagine that that'll be the last thing we do in this space, because there is so much opportunity to move this ball forward on any number of fronts. So with that, we can give our panelists a round of applause. And thank you, folks.